I married her before Red Valley fell. Before Tarek died. Before the name Sheena became a curse in this town.
They tied her in the square for shame, then he married her in front of the whole town. The church bells, pealing down from the top of the weathered wooden spire, rang in long, urgent tolls, tearing through the sweltering afternoon heat of Larkspur Ridge. These bells weren't calling people to prayer. They were calling them to bear witness, to pass judgment, to condemn, to tie someone to the memory of a wound the entire town had never let heal. The red dirt square, usually only filled with the sound of wind and horses' hooves at midday, was now thick with people. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and the lingering scent of liquor on a few close breaths. Men, their hands calloused from digging soil and pulling triggers, stood in tight clusters, their gazes cold and taut as bowstrings. Women clutched their small children close, their fingers gripping until they were white, as if the children would vanish if they let go. The skinny children, with dark circles under their eyes from lack of sleep, clung to their mothers' skirts. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but instinct told them something cruel was about to unfold, the familiar scent of a mob that had found a target to unleash all its fear, rage, and hatred. In the center of the square, near the stone post once used for tying up livestock, and sometimes those deemed not fit to live, Sheena stood. Her wrists were bound tightly with a hemp rope. The cord, damp with sweat and dust, dug deeper into her flesh with every small movement. Swollen purple bruises stood out against her sun-tanned skin, throbbing with each beat of her heart. Her long black hair, once her pride, was now tangled, matted with road dust and the smell of smoke. The north wind swept through, pasting a few sweat-soaked strands across her dark cheeks, sticking like an indelible stain. She wore a faded, earth-toned dress, its hem tattered from days of relentless travel and the rough hands of her captors. All around her, the murmuring of the crowd was a hive of buzzing bees, a mix of short and long sentences, mostly whispered accusations, just loud enough for neighbors to hear. The sound of boots scuffing the dry ground, the soft clink of a knife against its wooden sheath, the spitting into the dust. Each sound, no matter how small, was like a drop of water filling a bowl already full, threatening to overflow into a torrent of violence at any moment. China looked up, her deep black eyes unwavering, but inside was a dull ache, the pain of someone who was used to being seen as a walking sin. Every gaze was a phantom spear aimed at her. Some people sneered, others gritted their teeth. All of them saw in her gaunt but unbowed figure something that needed to be erased from their world. Above, a gray cloud slowly swallowed the sun, sending a thin chill crawling across the square. But the true cold didn't come from the wind, it came from the eyes of 100 people, from the tight hemp rope, and from the knowing feeling that with just one verdict, the crowd would descend like wolves. Sheena didn't lower her head. Her chin was raised, her deep-water eyes looking straight ahead at the crowd surrounding her, not with hope or a plea, but with a quiet, unsettling contempt for those who had granted themselves the right to judge. From a makeshift wooden justice stand, Judge Thaddeus Morgan stepped down. His long black robe billowed slightly in the wind, his broad-brimmed hat obscuring a portion of eyes more accustomed to passing sentences than to listening. He held a piece of paper, his voice hoarse but clear, each word falling like a stone into a dry well. 3 days ago, he said, this woman returned to our land without explanation, without an apology. He paused, his gaze boring into Sheena. She is the widow of Tarek, the right-hand gunslinger of the Red Valley gang, the same bastards who bled this town dry, burned our supply lines, and left 3 of our sons buried just outside town. Lo! A ripple of whispers spread like wind through dry grass. One man spat on the ground, the spittle mixing with the red dust into a dirty streak. A woman whispered something to her neighbor, her eyes filled with disgust. Morgan continued, last week, the body of Edgar Rusk, the Red Valley butcher, was found in Devil's Hollow. Beside him was a map, stolen land deeds, and a ledger. A name was circled in red ink, Sheena. A shrill cry broke from the crowd. She brings us bad luck. Another voice, a low, rough male voice, added, she survived when all the others died. There must be a dirty reason. Sheena remained silent, no trembling, no rebuttal. But her eyes briefly flickered, as if someone had torn open an old wound. Morgan's voice hardened. There's no evidence you ever fought against the gang. No sign of remorse. The ledger is proof. You were not an outsider. You were one of them. A small stone landed near Sheena's feet, kicking up dust on the hem of her dress. A boy, no older than 10, stepped out of the crowd, his face smudged, his hands clutching a larger stone. He raised his arm, ready to throw. Sheena looked him straight in the eye, unflinching, and then a shout rang out, not loud but piercing enough to slice through the air. "Stop!" The noise instantly subsided. Everyone turned to look at the dark figure who had just stepped out from the porch of the blacksmith's shop. He was a tall man, his dark gray shirt stained with sweat, his pants dusty, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, his boots making a solid sound on the ground, and the crowd instinctively parted before he could even touch anyone's shoulder. "She's my wife," he said, his voice low, steady, not raised but clear enough for everyone to hear. A wave of murmuring erupted. Judge Morgan blinked, then scowled. "What did you just say?" The man stopped about 10 paces from Sheena, raising his head so the light hit his face. The whispers turned into gasps. Jesse Vane, the quiet blacksmith, the one no one paid much attention to beyond fixing horseshoes and forging plow blades. "I married her before Red Valley fell," Jesse said, his eyes never leaving Morgan's eyes. "Before Tarek died, before the name Sheena became a curse in this town. She left that life. I gave her a new one." Morgan smirked, half smiling, half disdainful. "No one ever heard of this. Because here, the truth doesn't matter," Jesse replied, his voice calm but firm. "Only the fear that's passed down in whispers." Morgan squinted, as if weighing whether this man was a fool or a brave man. "You know the law doesn't recognize an unregistered marriage." Jesse gave a slight nod. "Article 12, the Marital Protection Clause. If the marriage precedes the accusations, the husband has the right to seek immunity from prosecution for his wife." A scoff came from the back of the crowd, but a few eyes showed a flicker of unease. A simple country blacksmith had just cited the law to the judge's face. Morgan took a deep breath, then growled, 7 days. The two of you will live together under supervision. If your story is a lie, you both hang." Jesse nodded without hesitation. "I understand." "Oh." Morgan motioned for his men to cut the rope, but Jesse stepped forward, untying the knot himself. The rope fell to the ground, leaving raw red marks on Sheena's wrists. She recoiled her hands, not looking at him, and turned away, walking through the still watching crowd, who were a mix of suspicion, curiosity, and resentment. Jesse walked beside her, a distance just enough not to touch, but enough for everyone to see them leaving the square together. The house the town gave them was on the northern edge of Larkspur Ridge, where the grassy hills began to slope into the pine forest. From a distance, it looked like a tired wooden corpse, the roof tilted to one side like an old person with a hunched back. A window pane was cracked, and the steps were rotting away. The smell of mildew and old soot entered their noses as soon as they stepped inside. In a corner of the fireplace, an old bird's nest lay scattered with feathers and dry leaves. Sheena stood at the threshold, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, not bothering to hide her cold gaze toward Jesse as he set his gear down on a warped wooden table. He said nothing, just rolled up his sleeves and started to clean. Dust rose in thin clouds in the golden afternoon light, painting blurry lines in the air. "Why?" Her voice came from behind him, dry as drought, cracked earth. Jesse looked up, his hand still holding a wooden board. "Because if I hadn't, they would have hanged you before sunset." "That's not it." Sheena stepped inside, each step measuring the distance. "Why would a white man like you who was with Tarek's gang want to save someone like me?" He put the board down and looked her straight in the eye. "Because I ran once, and that time I left you behind." Sheena pressed her lips together. In her memory, the smell of smoke from the night Red Valley fell was still vivid, the smell of burning flesh, burning wood, the sound of gunfire mixing with screams. Tarek had died somewhere in that chaos, and Jesse, His back had disappeared into a crevice in the canyon while she was still struggling in her bindings. "You think I'll forget?" she asked, her voice low, each word falling off a cliff's edge. Jesse didn't flinch. "I don't need you to forget. I need you to live for 7 more days. This." She gave a thin, soundless laugh, just a cruel curve of her lips. Then she turned her back and walked out onto the front steps, leaving him with the dusty room and unwashed memories. On the second day, Jesse started repairing the roof. He climbed up with a few planks, a hammer, and half a bag of nails bought with the little money he had. Sheena sat on the steps, her dress folded neatly under her feet, looking out at the distant hills. She said nothing. When he finished the first section, his shirt soaked with sweat, Jesse came down and dug a small patch of ground beside the rickety fence. He quietly planted a few bags of wildflower seeds, then covered them with soil. That afternoon, Sheena walked out and stopped by the freshly tilled patch of land. "What flowers?" Jesse looked up from where he was watering. "The kind you used to grow behind Tarek's tent. The ones you talked to when you thought no one was listening." "Vet." She froze for a moment, then turned away, hiding her eyes. The wind carried the smell of damp, newly watered earth, a scent that made a very thin string in her heart tremble. Townspeople started to visit. First came Mrs. Bensley, the preacher's wife, a Bible in her hand, her eyes scanning Sheena as if searching for signs of sin. "Do you read the good book often?" she asked, her voice just loud enough for the neighbors outside to hear. Sheena replied curtly, "Number, Mrs." Bensley narrowed her eyes. Jesse spoke up, interrupting, "But she knows how to tend the land and keep a fire going through the night. Things the books don't teach." She left, leaving the smell of suspicion hanging in the air. On the third day, the general store owner stopped by, carrying a bag of nails he wanted Jesse to take a look at. But his eyes kept darting inside the house, where Sheena was sitting and mending a shirt. Jesse didn't let her have to answer anything, keeping all conversations on the porch until the guest left. Sheena realized he never asked her anything about her past, never tried to bridge the gap she had built. He just quietly worked, fixing the door, chopping wood, sweeping the soot from the fireplace, cooking dinner, and always leaving more on her plate. On the evening of the 4th day, the sky lowered like a dark gray curtain slowly closing. In the distance, the field stretched out like a still lake, stained a deep purple by the sunset. Thin streaks of clouds were tinged red by the last light of day, then quickly faded to charcoal. The air smelled of damp earth and the leftover burning wood from the blacksmith's forge. Sheena sat alone on the back steps, the hem of her dress dusty and brown. Her back was slightly hunched forward, her elbows on her knees, as if she were trying to hold on to the warmth of the day before the night took over completely. In her ears, the chirping of insects began, slow and steady like the whispers of the darkness. Jesse came out of the house, carrying a glass of water. The faint light from the oil lamp in the kitchen cast his long shadow on the ground. He set the glass down beside her, his movements quiet, just close enough for her to know he was there. "They think we're lying," Sheena said, her voice calm, but in the silence that followed the words was the heavy weight of something that couldn't be ignored. Her eyes were still fixed on the distance, where the darkness was slowly swallowing the horizon. "Maybe," Jesse replied. He sat down beside her, maintaining a distance that was both cautious and respectful. That distance was like a thin thread connecting the two of them, close enough to hear a breath, far enough not to make her pull away. "But I don't care." Sheena turned to him, her eyes like a thin blade just pulled from its sheath, illuminating more than they cut. "So, who are you doing all this for? For me? Or for yourself?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze fell to his hands, calloused hands from hammer and iron, with white cracks at the knuckles. "For my peace," he said slowly, as if placing each word carefully on the ground. "Not yours, but if it keeps you alive, that's better." The confession was unembellished, without promise. It was as raw as unsanded wood, revealing the true grain underneath. Sheena didn't know whether to feel reassured or even more guarded. Within her, the two feelings intertwined like two opposing currents. One wanted to believe, the other wanted to find a crack to retreat through. She turned back to look at the small patch of land by the fence where Jesse had planted the wildflowers a few days ago. The earth was still bare, with only a few tiny cracks the seedlings had not yet broken through. The wind swept by, rustling the remaining dry grass, creating a gentle whisper. She saw a familiar image there waiting, not knowing if those seeds would truly sprout, just as she didn't know if a man who had once run away would truly stay. And just like the field being consumed by the night, she couldn't see what was ahead. A strange feeling crept into her heart. Not trust, not exactly doubt. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, with a strong wind blowing up from below, knowing she wasn't ready to jump, but unable to turn back. In that boundary, Sheena realized she was still sitting there, and Jessie was still sitting beside her. The darkness finally swallowed the last hint of purple from the sunset. In the silence, there was only the sound of insects and her own heartbeat, which she felt she could hear more clearly because of the distance between them. Neither of them said another word, but somewhere, very small and very vague, like a crack in the dry earth waiting for rain, something was beginning to shift. The sixth day began with an unusual morning. The wind blew from the west, carrying the smell of smoke that wasn't from a stove. Sheena recognized it immediately. It was the smell of wood burning outdoors, a smell she could never forget in her lifetime. Jessie was chopping wood behind the house when Sheena quickly walked to the fence. On the foothills, a plume of black smoke was rising, twisting against the pale blue sky. It was too close to be a forest fire, too small to be a charcoal pit. "Jessie," she began, but before she could finish, a gunshot rang out, sharp and crisp, like a whip cracking through the morning. He threw down his axe, rushing to the porch, just in time to see the front door burst open. A tall man in a dark leather jacket stepped inside. On his left cheek was a jagged scar, and his eyes were a murky brown like pond water. In his hand, a black pistol was pointed directly at Sheena. "Hello, widow," he growled, drawing out each syllable. "Remember me?" Sheena clenched her fist. "Cole Danner." He laughed, revealing yellowed teeth. "You have a good memory. I'm the one who had to bury half my gang because of you and this damn town. Now, I've come to collect." Jessie took a step forward. "Put the gun down, Cole." Cole tilted his head, a look of mockery in his eyes. "Jesse Vane, the traitor. I didn't get a chance to shoot you in the back all those years ago." As soon as he finished speaking, he moved the gun closer to Sheena. "You're coming with me. And you, Jesse, you're going to die right here, in the house you tried to rebuild as if it was never a pile of ashes." Sheena didn't answer. Her eyes quickly darted toward the back door, a distance of 10 paces. Cole caught the look and sneered. "Don't even think about running. I set your house on fire before I walked in." And just as he said, a crackling sound came from the kitchen, and the smell of smoke grew thicker. Flames began to lick at the wooden walls. Cole backed toward the door, motioning for Sheena to go first. Jesse followed, but Cole's gun instantly turned to him. "One more step, and I shoot." They walked down the slope leading to Devil's Hollow, where the red earth dipped down and sharp rocks jutted out like animal teeth. The wind here carried a damp, cold smell, mixed with the smoke from the burning house behind them. Cole tied Sheena's hands, securing the rope to the reins of a black horse, then pushed Jesse to the ground. "I'm going to let you watch her leave. Think of it as a last gift." Jesse gritted his teeth, but couldn't react in time. Cole turned his back, intending to mount the horse. That was when Sheena acted. She twisted her wrists, sliding the rope up to the narrower part of her joints, a trick she had learned from the days she was held captive by Red Valley. The rope loosened enough for her to yank hard, then she used the same rope to wrap around Cole's wrist, pulling him toward her. Caught by surprise, he lost his balance, and the gun went astray. Jesse lunged forward, but Sheena had already spun around, using her knee to hit Cole's hip. He roared, and the gun fell to the ground. She quickly bent down, picked up the gun, and backed away toward Jesse, holding the barrel steady with both hands, her eyes fixed and unblinking. "Let go of the horse," she said, her voice low but cold as steel. Cole froze, his gaze flickering from Jesse to Sheena, as if he couldn't believe the sight before him. A woman he once thought would only stand and wait to be rescued was now pointing a gun at him. "Let go of the horse," she repeated. He gave a harsh laugh, but slowly let go of the reins. Jesse picked up the rope from the ground, stepped forward, and tightly bound Cole's hands. When they turned back, Sheena's house was engulfed in flame. Smoke billowed high, the firelight casting a red glow on the edge of the forest. There was nothing left to save, only the crackling sound of wood popping like breaking bones. Sheena stood and watched, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline. Jesse walked up beside her, not touching, just standing there. "You saved us." She didn't look at him, her eyes still on the fire. "I saved myself." The house burned down, leaving a charred skeleton on the bare ground. Ash mixed with road dust, swirling into small eddies as the wind shifted. Jesse stood a few paces away. His shoulder was patched with a torn piece of cloth. The cut from Cole's knife was still seeping blood, but he didn't say a word. Sheena sat on a rock, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep, looking at the land that used to be her home. Not a single tear, not a single complaint, just a long, steady breath, as if she let it falter, she would collapse immediately. Cole was taken to the town's guard post. The townspeople came to watch, not to help, but to bear witness. When they heard the story of how Sheena herself had disarmed Cole and tied him up, the eyes that had once held only contempt now held something else, caution, and something close to respect. Judge Morgan said nothing when Jesse handed Cole over to the guards. He just glanced at Sheena for a moment, gave a short nod, and turned away. A small but clear sign. The judgment had begun to crack. A few days later, Jesse woke up from a fever. Sheena's arm was still on his forehead, feeling his temperature had dropped. The room they were in wasn't a house, but the old storage shed behind the blacksmith shop, the smell of hot iron and dust mixing together. "You still owe me a house," Sheena said, her voice hoarse after many nights of watching over him. Jesse smiled weakly. "Then we'll build a new one. Somewhere else. Far from this town, far from its memories." That. She was silent, but didn't pull her hand away. They left Larkspur Ridge in the spring, taking with them a few forging tools, the wildflower seeds, and an unformed idea. They found a small valley to the south where the grass grew tall. A stream ran year-round, and there wasn't a single house in sight. The new house was built of pine, with a sloping roof to let the snow slide off in the winter. Sheena chose a spot to plant the wildflowers right in front of the porch. The same flowers from the small patch of land by the old fence this time. They grew strong, a vibrant yellow under the sun. Jesse built a forge on the side of the house. The sound of his hammer hitting hot iron echoed far, mingling with the sound of the stream and the wind blowing through the tall grass. Sheena built a horse stable, planted more vegetables, and to Jesse's greatest surprise started building more small houses. "For who?" he asked, when he saw her laying the first rafters. "For the people who have nowhere left to go," she replied, not looking up. "Orphans, outcasts, even native people or white folk. Here the past doesn't decide who lives or dies." Jesse looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "Widow's brand." She raised an eyebrow. "The name," he explained. "A brand to remember that this place was built from loss, but also a brand of hope." Sheena was silent for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Widow's brand." Rumors of a homestead open to those who had nowhere left to go spread faster than they expected. A mixed-race child, the son of a mercenary and a native woman, was the first to be brought there. He didn't say a word for the first 3 days, just sat on the porch looking at the flowers. Then came a group of 3 orphan sisters from a neighboring town, then a man who had lost a leg in the war, shunned by his old village. Each person brought a story, a wound. And at Widow's Brand, they found not a miracle, but work, a hot meal, and a safe bed. Sheena still kept her distance from the past. She didn't talk more about Tarek, didn't mention the night Red Valley fell. Jesse didn't try to pry things she didn't want to talk about. They worked, ate together, fixed the house, tended the flowers, a rhythm of life where trust wasn't given freely, but built gradually, like a roof being laid plank by plank. The first winter at Widow's Brand was harsh. Snow blanketed the entire valley, and the wind cut like a knife. But the fire in the hearth never went out. The small houses they had built were enough to keep everyone warm. On New Year's Eve, when everyone was asleep, Sheena walked out onto the porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. Jessie followed, putting a cloak over her shoulders. "You know," she said softly, I never thought I'd live to see a place like this." Jessie was silent, just looking at the specks of light in her eyes. "But I don't want to call it luck," she continued. "Luck is something that can disappear easily. This is effort, a choice." "No." He nodded, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder the first time she didn't pull away. Above, the stars were still, but down here, at Widow's Brand, something new had taken root. A family that didn't need to be of the same blood, a community that didn't need to be of the same color, and the past, though it couldn't be erased, had been pushed to the edges, giving way to the only thing that mattered living on. Jessie lay motionless on the makeshift wooden bed in the old storage shed, the smell of medicinal herbs and rusty iron mixing together. Light filtered through a crack in the planks, touching his pale face. Sheena sat beside him, her hand tightly gripping his, her thumb unconsciously stroking the callous spot on his palm, so familiar it felt like touching a memory itself. The wound in his side was deep and dirty. Cole's knife had not only cut into his flesh but into his breath. For 3 days, Sheena had changed his bandages, pressed to stop the bleeding, and watched over him through his fevers. Each time Jessie groaned in his delirium, she felt something tighten in her chest, both anger that he had risked his life and a fear of realizing she didn't want to lose him again. On the 4th morning since Jessie was wounded, the day came slowly, as if the sun was also hesitant to enter the small wooden room where he lay. Outside, dew still hung on the long blades of grass, weighing them down as if to touch the earth. The distant chirping of birds was sparse, drowned out by the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. Sheena sat on the old chair beside the bed, her back straight, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. For the past few days, she had never left for too long, only going out when she needed to get water or change the bandages. Jessie's wound, a treacherous stab to the side, had kept him in a feverish delirium for 3 nights. Each time he breathed heavily or groaned softly, she held her breath, afraid it would be his last. Her hands, once calloused from labor, were now red from changing bandages, washing cloths, and holding his hand through each feverish episode. But that hand never let go, as if the thin thread connecting him to life was the warmth from her palm. The first light of day filtered through a crack in the curtain, touching Jessie's sweaty forehead. His eyelashes fluttered slightly. Then his eyes slowly opened a blurry, dazed look like someone who had just swum up from the bottom of a deep lake. But just a moment later, when he saw Sheena, his lips curled up, very slightly but noticeably. "Still here?" His voice was hoarse and weak, but with a mix of surprise and relief. Sheena looked at him, her eyes red but with a light she couldn't easily name. She replied, her voice hoarse and low, "I don't run away." Jessie tried to lift his hand, but his strength only allowed him to touch her wrist. His fingers trembled, but the touch was as steady as if he needed to confirm that she was really there, right beside him. "Good," he said, his breath like wind through a crack in the rock. "Because I didn't get a chance to give you this." "No." He slowly turned his head, a movement that caused his whole body to ache. His other hand reached with difficulty toward the chair beside the bed, where his jacket was folded. His fingers fumbled in the pocket, then pulled out a small object wrapped in a worn old piece of cloth. Sheena watched his every movement, her eyebrows slightly furrowed, she didn't know why. But her heart tightened, as if she was waiting for something more important than any words. When the cloth was unwrapped, the faint light shone on a silver ring. It was simple, not set with any stones. The surface had a long scratch, and the circle was slightly misshapen, as if it had been through many years and unforgettable bumps. "My mother's ring," Jessie whispered. His voice was slow, as if he was afraid he would lose the chance if he spoke too quickly. "Last time, I wasn't brave enough to keep you with me. This time, if you'll have me, I want another chance." The air in the room thickened. Outside, the wind still rustled through the roof, but Sheena heard nothing but the sound of her own heart. She looked at the ring. It wasn't shiny like new gold, it didn't have a flashy beauty, but in her eyes it was strangely heavy, heavy with the journey it had been on, with the hands that had held it, and with the silent promise it now carried. She knew that to give her this ring today, Jessie didn't just need strength, but also a courage he had never had before. Sheena was silent for a long time. In that silence, memories flooded back. Their first meeting when Jesse was still part of the gang, his eyes as he turned and walked away, the years she had to fight on her own, and the moment he stepped out of the crowd to defend her in the town square. Finally, she held out her hand, without a word, but her eyes were enough for Jesse to understand. He carefully slid the ring onto her ring finger. It was a little loose, but it fit perfectly with the look the two of them exchanged. In that moment, there were no fireworks or cheers, only a shared breath and an invisible thread that was now tied tighter than ever. Jesse leaned his head back on the pillow, his eyes still on her hand. Sheena gently turned the ring, the cool feeling of the silver spreading across her skin, mingling with the warmth of what had just happened. Outside, the dew had evaporated, and the morning light was beginning to flood the wildflower field. In the small room, a silent promise had just been planted like a seedling in deep soil, not yet sprouted but sure to take root. When Jesse was strong enough to stand up after his injury, his first steps outside were not just about leaving the cramped room, but about entering a new world that had just been formed. Sheena walked beside him, her hand not touching him but close enough that if he stumbled, she could catch him. Together they walked down the dirt path leading to the small square of Widow's Brand. This place was now completely different from the day Sheena first set foot there back then. It was just a few temporary shacks with wind whistling through the walls. Now, there were more than a dozen houses built. Kitchen smoke curling up in the afternoon, the smell of new wood mixing with the scent of baking bread. News of Sheena saving Jesse and capturing Cole had traveled ahead of them. When the two of them appeared, people had gathered in a wide circle. It was no longer a mob ready to condemn or point fingers. The air today was thick with a special kind of silence, the silence of people who wanted to see with their own eyes to believe what they had heard. Old George, who had once not hidden the coldness in his eyes when he saw Sheena, now walked out from the crowd with a cane. His white hair trembled slightly with each breath. In his hands was a new wooden sign, the carved letters still fresh with shavings. He stopped in front of Jesse, his eyes for the first time looking at both of them directly, without avoidance. Then he held out the sign. On it, the letters were straight and deep, carved in both English and the native language. Widow's Brand, a place for survivors. In that moment, Jesse said nothing. He just placed his hand on the sign, feeling the grooves of the letters under his fingertips, each carved like an acknowledgement that this place now had a name, and that name was for all those who had been left on the fringes. A small sound of footsteps rang out, then a tiny figure rushed over and hugged Sheena's leg tightly. It was the mixed-race child, with tangled curly hair and wide brown eyes. He was the child of an immigrant and a native woman, a child that both communities considered not belonging. His voice was trembling but clear. "You won't leave me, will you?" Sheena bent down. Her hands, calloused but gentle, softly smoothed his tangled hair, brushing the strands from his forehead. In that moment, her eyes weren't just looking at the child, but also seeing her old self, the one who had stood in the middle of a crowd of strangers, judged simply for the blood that ran in her veins. "No, child," she said, her voice low but as firm as an old tree trunk. "Here, no one is left behind." The words rang out, slow and clear, causing many people to bow their heads. Some eyes were red. Some hands, once accustomed to clenching tightly in caution, now relaxed at their sides. No one applauded. There was no need, because what was spreading through the crowd was not loud celebration, but a form of silent respect, the kind that only comes when people have witnessed courage and compassion with their own eyes. The people standing there understood. Widow's Brand was not just a few houses. It was the only place where a mixed-race child could ask that question and get a certain answer. It was a place where a former criminal, a native widow, or someone who had lost everything could start over without being asked, "Where are you from?" Jesse glanced at Sheena. She was still bent over the child, her hand not leaving his hair. In his eyes, that image was both gentle and resilient, and he knew this was the true foundation of Widow's Brand, compassion for the castaways. From that day on, Anyone who walked through the village gate had to see the new wooden sign. The letters were carved deep and straight, still smelling of fresh wood shavings. Widow's Brand, a place for survivors. People touched the sign as if to verify, then smiled. Some quietly nodded. Others stood for a long time rereading each word. And then they walked in, not just looking for a roof or a meal, but for a place where their hearts could finally stop being left behind. Sheena's words that day, "Here, no one is left behind," seemed to have anchored themselves in everyone's memory. It wasn't an empty promise, because the one who said it had proven it with every small act, every hand reaching out to those who were sinking. That night, a new moon hung low on the horizon, its silver light thinly scattered on the new blades of grass. The spring wind carried the smell of damp earth and the faint scent of wildflowers. Jesse and Sheena sat on the porch of their new house, the house that had been built just a few weeks ago, the pine wood still giving off a sweet smell. In front of them was the wildflower field, swaying, the small flowers seeming to wave to each passing gust of wind. In the distance, a few houses had their lights out. Only the red glow of embers in the kitchen and the sound of a dog barking echoing from the end of the village. Jesse leaned back against the porch post, his hands resting loosely on his knees, staring at the field as if it were the only thing in the world. With his other hand, he gently swirled the half-empty wooden cup. In the soft light, his face lost the hardened look of a blacksmith, replaced by a rare peace. Sheena sat beside him, the distance not far, but enough for both to have their own space to breathe. On her hand, the silver ring she had put on the day before reflected the moonlight into a small halo of light. At first, it was cool, like a foreign object she hadn't gotten used to yet. But now, that feeling was gone. It sat there naturally, as if it had been on her hand for a very long time. For a long time, neither of them said anything. There was only the sound of the wind filtering through the porch roof and the rustling of leaves. Then Jesse spoke, his voice low but firm. "This time," he said, his eyes still on the field, "I won't run away, no matter what happens." Sheena tilted her head, looking at him in the moonlight. The words weren't a solemn vow, but sounded like a simple statement, but it was that very simplicity that touched her heart. Because she knew, to say it, he had crossed a long distance of silence, of regrets and determination. She smiled gently. Not much, just enough to make the corners of her lips curve slightly, but the spring wind seemed to recognize it and brought the scent of wildflowers toward him. "I know," she replied slowly, "and this time I'll believe." Between them, no more words were needed. The silence was no longer heavy, but warm as a quilt on a spring night. Outside, the field was still moving, the wildflowers still bowing to the wind, just like the people at Widow's Brand, small but resilient, finding a way to stand straight after the storm. And right there on that porch, between the new moon and the scent of flowers, two people who had been pushed far apart by life were now sitting together, facing a new path where promises and trust were no longer luxuries, but things they could give each other every day. In the sky, the stars seemed closer. And, at Widow's Brand, two people who had once been judged by the whole world had found the only thing that still mattered: to stay together and never turn their backs on each other again. Summer arrived, bringing with it waves of people to Widow's Brand. There were families who had lost their homes in a wildfire, ex-prisoners shunned by both communities, young women with children fleeing abuse. Sheena didn't ask where they came from, only asked, "What do you know how to do?" If they knew, they started right away. If not, they learned. Jesse taught them to forge. Sheena taught them to farm and build houses. In those days, sweat flowed more than words. But when the sun set, everyone had a hot bowl of soup and a safe place to sleep. Gradually, the cautious looks disappeared. A native person could sit and eat next to a white person who had once considered their tribe an enemy. A mixed-race child was no longer asked, "Who's your mother?" but simply called, "Hey, come eat with us." Widow's Brand became a place where no one used the past as a weapon. That afternoon, the sun slanted to the west, casting a golden light on the rows of young vegetables. Sheena knelt in the dirt, her hands quickly pulling out each weed that had grown between the lettuce rows. The smell of fresh earth rose up, mixing with the scent of new leaves, bringing a